Lena sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, her eyes tired but unwilling to close. The flickering glow of the TV screen cast long shadows across the room. She had spent the last few hours trying to drown out the noise in her head, the constant hum of thoughts that refused to quiet. It had been a long, exhausting day at work, and the last thing she wanted was to deal with the creeping sense of unease that always followed her home. With a deep sigh, she stood up and walked over to the old radio sitting on the kitchen counter. It was something she had picked up at a thrift store years ago. A beautiful antique, though she hadn't expected it to work when she bought it. To her surprise, it had come to life with a crackle and a hiss as soon as she plugged it in. She never listened to the radio much, but tonight she needed something to fill the silence. As she turned the dial, static filled the room. Then suddenly, a clear voice pierced through the noise. At 3:47 p.m. today, Lena Larson walked into the office of Dr. Merton, hoping for answers. Little did she know, that appointment would change her life forever. Lena froze, her fingers trembling on the dial. The voice was clear, but no station was listed. Just static, and then those words, her name, the appointment. She hadn't told anyone about that, not even her closest friend, Sarah. No one knew. The voice continued, unfazed by her shock. Dr. Merton told you that you were suffering from anxiety, didn't he? But what he didn't tell you was that you've been under surveillance for months. That's how they knew exactly what you would say. Lena's blood ran cold. Her breath caught in her throat as the voice went on, as if reading from a script she had never given. Tonight you will make a choice, Lena. A choice that will alter the course of everything you know. You'll have to decide how much of the truth you're willing to face. The radio static returned with a sharp crack, and Lena's heart pounded in her chest. She stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall behind her. Her mind raced, struggling to comprehend what she had just heard. She glanced around her small apartment, the feeling of being watched creeping in like a cold breeze. The air felt thicker now, as though the shadows in the corners were closing in on her. She didn't know who was speaking, but they knew far too much about her. Lena grabbed the radio and began turning the dial furiously, trying to find any station, any noise that could explain what was happening. But there was only silence, followed by the occasional, distorted crackle of static. She sat down on the couch, clutching the radio in her hands as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. The voice had been clear, calm, almost too calm, as if it had been waiting for her to hear it, waiting for her to listen. Minutes stretched into hours, or so it felt. She tried to push the voice out of her mind, tried to tell herself that it was just some kind of bizarre prank, but deep down, she knew that couldn't be true. Whoever or whatever had spoken into that radio knew things about her that no one else could possibly know. Then, just as she was about to turn the radio off and call Sarah for reassurance, the voice returned, as cold and unsettling as before. You're not alone, Lena. They're watching you right now. And when you least expect it, they'll make their move. Lena's blood ran cold. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest again, each beat louder than the last. She stood up quickly, glancing nervously at the door to her apartment. The windows were shut, the curtains drawn, but it didn't matter. She could feel eyes on her. The voice had given her a warning that felt too real, too imminent. The darkness in the corners of the room seemed to pulse with life, as if something unseen was watching, waiting for her to make the wrong move. She stepped toward the window, cautiously peering out between the blinds. The street below was quiet, too quiet. No cars, no people, nothing. It was as though the world had stopped moving. Suddenly, her phone buzzed on the counter. Lena jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. She hadn't heard it ring, hadn't heard any notifications. Yet there it was, vibrating on the countertop. Her hands shaking, she picked it up and unlocked the screen. There was one new message. She didn't recognize the number. "Lena, you shouldn't have heard that. They're coming. There's no escaping it." Lena's breath hitched in her chest. She turned to the radio again, but it remained silent. No voice, no sound, just the steady hum of static. Then her phone buzzed again. "You're already marked. Your life will never be the same." Lena's mind reeled. What was going on? Who was behind this? And most importantly, who was watching her right now? Her pulse raced, and she realized, too late, that the eerie feeling in her gut wasn't just paranoia. Someone or something was out there, and they knew everything about her. The next message came through almost immediately, sending a cold shiver down her spine. "It's too late. The choice has already been made." Before Lena could process the message, the radio crackled to life once more, and the voice spoke. "Goodbye, Lena. The shadows are closing in." Suddenly, the radio went silent. A loud bang echoed from somewhere outside her apartment, followed by a distant, hollow scraping sound that seemed to come from just behind the walls. The shadows in the room grew darker, shifting as if alive. Lena backed away slowly, her legs unsteady. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears. The quiet of her apartment had been replaced by the overwhelming feeling that something was terribly wrong. The voice had been right. They were coming. She wasn't alone anymore, and she had no idea how to escape. Lena didn't sleep that night, not even for a moment. Every time she closed her eyes, the voice would return, whispering in her mind, louder than the pounding of her own heart. The voice on the radio, the texts on her phone, and the scraping sound from behind the walls. It was all too much. She paced back and forth in her living room, trying to make sense of what had happened. She tried to convince herself that it was all just a series of strange coincidences. But deep down, she knew better. Whoever or whatever had been watching her, they weren't done yet. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, its sound filling the silence of the apartment. The room felt suffocating, as if the walls were slowly closing in on her. She ran a hand through her hair, her mind racing. How could anyone know so much about her? Her appointment with Dr. Merton, her fear of being watched. The voice had even mentioned her darkest thoughts, things she had never said aloud to anyone. The phone buzzed again, snapping her from her thoughts. Lena froze. She hadn't been expecting any calls, not after the strange text messages. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. It was another message from the same unknown number. You thought it was a warning, but it was an invitation. They're already here. Lena's stomach twisted in a knot. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but she couldn't bring herself to reply. She didn't even know who they were. But she knew one thing for sure: they were real. The feeling in her gut, the one that had only intensified since the voice had first spoken, was proof of that. Her apartment felt different now. The air seemed thicker, heavier. The quiet was deafening, as though even the walls had become aware of the danger that lurked just outside her view. She walked cautiously to the window, peering through the blinds, half expecting to see someone watching her from the street below. But the street was empty, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Nothing unusual, and yet the silence felt wrong. The kind of wrong that made every nerve in her body stand on end. Lena jumped when the radio suddenly crackled to life, breaking the eerie stillness. Her heart stopped for a moment, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. The voice returned. "Do you feel it, Lena? The weight of their presence. They're closer than you think. You can't hide from them." Lena's breath quickened. She stumbled back from the radio, her legs unsteady. This time, the voice wasn't just speaking into the room. It was inside her head. The words echoed in her mind, chilling her to the core. She could almost feel them, whatever they were, closing in on her. She needed answers. She needed to know who was doing this and, more importantly, how to stop it before it consumed her completely. She grabbed the phone again, her hands shaking as she searched for any trace of the number that had been sending her the messages. The screen flickered, but no new messages appeared. She clicked on her call history, hoping to find something, anything that could explain this nightmare. But as she scrolled, she noticed something strange. Her recent calls were gone. All of them. The call to Sarah from earlier that day, the brief check-in with her mom the day before, all vanished. Lena's heart sank. It was as if someone had wiped everything away. She scrolled back through the list a few more times, but each time, the screen remained empty. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She had no explanation for this, no rational reason that could make sense of what was happening. Then, her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her panic. This time, the message was different. "It's time to stop running, Lena. Come outside. They're waiting for you." Lena's hands clenched into fists as she read the message. Whoever was behind this, whatever was behind it, they knew where she was. They wanted her to come outside. Her mind screamed at her to ignore it, to lock the doors and never leave her apartment. But the voice had said something that stuck with her, something that had been eating at her since she first heard it. "You will make a choice." She didn't know what choice she had, but the pull was growing stronger with every passing minute. Something told her that staying inside wouldn't keep her safe forever. She had to face whatever was out there before it came to her. With trembling hands, Lena grabbed her coat and shoved her phone into her pocket. She felt like a marionette, controlled by forces beyond her comprehension. But the fear was too great to ignore, and her instinct to survive was louder than any rational thought. She stepped into the hallway of her building, the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The corridor stretched on before her, empty and silent. But as she approached the stairs, she heard something, a faint rustling sound, like something was moving just out of sight. Lena's breath hitched. She hesitated at the top of the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The air felt charged, thick with the weight of anticipation. Every shadow seemed to move, to twist and bend in unnatural ways. Then she heard it again, a soft, whispering sound, like someone calling her name from the depths of the darkness below. "Lena." The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't the radio. It wasn't a phone call. It was something else, something much closer. Something that had been hiding in the shadows all along. Lena's knees trembled as she took the first step down the stairs. She didn't know what she was walking into, but there was no turning back now. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused. Her breath was shallow, and her entire body was on edge. The door to the outside world was just a few feet away, but something held her back. Something was watching her from the darkness. And then, through the dimly lit hallway, she saw it. A figure standing motionless in the corner. It was shrouded in shadow, its features obscured by the dim light. But she could feel its gaze, cold, unblinking, and full of malice. "Lena," the voice whispered again, this time from the figure itself. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't know whether to run or to face whatever this thing was. But as she stood frozen in fear, a chilling realization washed over her. The figure wasn't alone. Lena turned toward the door, her hands shaking as she reached for the handle. The voice from the radio echoed once more, louder than ever before. "Too late, Lena. You've already made your choice." Lena's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded against her ribcage, threatening to break free. The figure in the shadows had not moved, but its presence felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. The words, "too late," echoed in her mind, louder than her frantic thoughts. The door to the outside world was mere inches away, yet something held her back. The figure, whoever or whatever it was, wasn't the only thing lurking in the dark. There was something more, something that had been waiting for her. A chill ran down her spine, and her fingers trembled as they brushed the door handle. But before she could pull it open, the whispering voice came again, this time louder and more forceful, like a command. "Lena, don't leave." She froze. Her hand remained on the handle, but she didn't turn to look at the figure. She could feel its gaze, burning into the back of her neck, but the voice had filled her entire mind now, and she couldn't escape it. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely above a breath. The words left her mouth before she could stop them. She knew it was a mistake. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the voice stopped. The air grew still, and for a moment, Lena thought she had imagined it. Maybe it was her fear playing tricks on her. Maybe she was just tired. But the moment of calm lasted only a fraction of a second before the shadows around her seemed to shift, and the figure took a slow step forward. "Not who I am, Lena, but what I am." The words slithered into her mind, and she felt her stomach churn. Her body wanted to move, wanted to run, but her feet were frozen to the ground. Her mind screamed at her to leave, but her body refused to obey. The figure stepped closer, its shape now clearer in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs stretching far beyond human proportions. The shadows seemed to cling to it, distorting its form like a mirage. But there was no mistaking the deep, hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. "Come closer," the voice coaxed, and this time, it came from somewhere inside her head, as though the figure was speaking directly to her thoughts. Lena stumbled back, her back pressed against the door. The figure's presence was like a heavy weight pressing against her chest. Her breath quickened, and panic surged through her veins. "What do you want from me?" she cried out, her voice shaky and full of fear. There was a long pause, and for a moment she thought it hadn't heard her. But then the voice returned, colder, darker than before. "You already know," it said, its voice dripping with an unnatural malice. "I've been watching you for a long time, Lena. Waiting." The words made her skin crawl. Watching her, waiting. Her mind raced back to the radio, the strange voice that had known everything about her. It all made sense now, too much sense. The messages, the feeling of being watched, the way the figure's eyes seemed to bore into her soul. The radio had warned her, but she hadn't listened, and now it was too late. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the apartment. Lena's body jerked, her heart leaping into her throat. She spun around, her eyes scanning the dark hallway, trying to make sense of the noise. But there was nothing. No broken glass, no sign of any intrusion. Just the oppressive silence that had settled over her. The figure moved again, its elongated limbs stretching out toward her. It reached for her with hands that were too long, too pale, like claws scraping against the walls as it advanced. Her breath hitched, and her body shook with fear. She wanted to scream, to run, but her voice was trapped in her throat. There was nowhere to go. And then, as if the darkness itself had heard her thoughts, the room seemed to shift. The walls pressed in around her, and the door, the one she had been standing so close to moments ago, was gone. The hallway, the stairs, the entire building felt like it had vanished. Lena was trapped. The figure took another step forward, its form becoming clearer with every passing moment. Its face, if you could even call it that, was a hollow mask, its features twisted and contorted. The eyes were too wide, too empty, and the mouth, when it opened, stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "You can't escape," It whispered, and this time, Lena felt the words crawl under her skin. "You've been chosen." The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, and for the briefest moment, the world around her flickered like a broken television screen. The shadows in the room pulsed, writhing and twisting like something alive, and Lena realized with horror that they were closing in on her. "Lena," the voice on the radio spoke again, this time directly in her ear. "You're not alone." She spun around, her eyes wide, but the room was still empty. Yet, she could feel it. Something was behind her, something close enough to reach out and touch her. And then, in the corner of her eye, she saw movement. It was fleeting, just a blur of shadow, but it was enough to send her into a panic. She turned back to face the figure, but it had disappeared. The darkness in the room seemed to swallow it whole. Lena stumbled backward, her mind racing. What was happening? Was this real? Or was it all just some sick dream she couldn't wake up from? She had to get out. She had to escape before it was too late. Her hand shot out, desperately searching for a way to break free. But the walls were smooth, featureless. There was no door, no window, nothing but endless darkness. And then, just as she thought she was losing her mind, the radio crackled again. "Lena," the voice said softly, like a lover's whisper, "you'll never leave." The voice wasn't in the room. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was inside her mind, in her blood, in her very soul. With a gut-wrenching realization, Lena understood. It wasn't just watching her. It was inside her, pulling the strings. Whatever was lurking in the shadows had already claimed her. And now there was no escape. The last thing Lena heard was the soft clicking of her own pulse in her ears, the blood rushing through her veins. And then, the darkness consumed her. Lena's eyes snapped open, but the darkness was all-consuming. She couldn't tell where she was, or if she was even still in the same place. The suffocating silence pressed in from all sides, and the crushing weight of fear threatened to swallow her whole. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat echoing in the stillness like a drum. And for a moment, she wasn't sure if she was even breathing. She strained her senses, trying to understand her surroundings, but everything felt wrong. The air smelled musty, thick with the stench of decay and mildew. She could feel the dampness of the floor beneath her, cold and clammy against her skin. But when she tried to move, her limbs felt heavy, like they didn't belong to her. Her mind was foggy, clouded by the confusion and terror still gripping her. Had she been unconscious? Was it all a dream? No, couldn't be. She remembered the shadows, the figure, the radio. The thought of the voice sent a jolt of fear through her. The whispering words, the way it had seeped into her thoughts and taken root deep inside her mind. The voice was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the faintest hum of static. Her breath caught in her throat. The radio. Without thinking, she pushed herself up from the cold, damp floor, stumbling slightly as her legs buckled beneath her. The sensation of being in a place that wasn't her own still hadn't fully registered, but the pull of the radio, the lure of that familiar, terrifying voice, was enough to drive her forward. The room around her seemed to flicker, as if the very walls were shifting, breathing. It was like walking through a dream, everything distorted, and yet, somehow, painfully real. The shadows twisted and writhed, as if they were alive, and Lena could feel them at the edge of her vision, moving, watching. She had to get to the radio. She had to hear it again. Her feet moved instinctively, each step bringing her closer to the source of the sound. The closer she got, the louder the static grew, the voice mixing with the noise, distorted like a broken signal. Lena, the voice slithered into her mind, like a cold, serpentine whisper. It was like a breath on the back of her neck, the words curling around her thoughts, wrapping tighter with each passing second. Her heart raced. She didn't want to hear it. She didn't want to listen, but she couldn't escape it. The pull was too strong. Lena, I'm here. Her fingers shook as she reached out, finding the radio sitting on a small table in front of her. The static intensified as her hand brushed against the cold surface, sending a shiver down her spine. She recoiled, pulling her hand back, but the static wouldn't stop. It was louder now, filling her ears, growing more frantic with each passing moment. No, please, she whispered, her voice cracking. She didn't want to hear it again, didn't want to know what it would say, but the words were already inside her, pulling her in. Lena, you can't escape. The voice was unmistakable now, clear and precise. It knew her name, it knew her fears, it knew everything. She felt the cold chill of realization settle deep in her gut. Where are you? Lena gasped, her voice barely a whisper, as if saying the words out loud would make the nightmare real. The radio crackled again, the static growing louder, overwhelming. It was like the sound of nails scraping across glass, the way it screeched in her ears. She clutched her head, trying to block it out, but the sound only grew louder. And then, through the cacophony, came the voice, calm, steady, like it was standing right next to her. I'm everywhere, Lena. I'm inside you. The words hit her like a physical blow, leaving her gasping for air. She backed away from the radio, her legs shaking beneath her. It wasn't just the voice on the radio anymore. It was inside her head. Her breathing became shallow, panicked. She could hear the pounding of her heart in her ears, drowning out everything else. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls tightening, pushing her closer to the breaking point. No, no, she whispered over and over, trying to convince herself that she was still in control. But the voice didn't stop. It never stopped. Why are you doing this? She cried out, the desperation in her voice rising with every passing second. The room fell silent. Then, like a sharp breath of wind, the voice returned, faint but full of menace. Because you listened. Lena's hands trembled as they gripped the edges of the table. She could feel the coldness of the air pressing in on her, the sensation of being watched, of being trapped in this place that wasn't her own. She wanted to scream, to run, to tear the radio apart. But something inside her knew it wouldn't change anything. She was already too far gone. But then, as suddenly as it had started, the static stopped. The voice fell silent. The room was still, too still. Lena held her breath, waiting for something to happen, for the next horrible revelation to tear through her mind. Nothing. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, the silence felt peaceful, almost comforting. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breath, trying to convince herself that it was over, that she could breathe again. And then she heard it, a soft shuffle of footsteps behind her. Lena's eyes shot open, her heart leaping in her chest. She spun around, but there was nothing, just the shadows stretching far into the corners of the room. She could feel it, though. It was there. Something was in the darkness, just out of sight, watching. Her stomach twisted. She could almost hear the figure's breath, as if it were waiting for her to make the first move. The shadows shifted, and Lena's mind screamed at her to run, but her feet were rooted to the ground. Then, through the silence, a voice, not from the radio this time, but from behind her, whispered again. Lena, her name. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat, praying that she wouldn't see what she feared. But it was there, standing just behind her. A tall figure, its features hidden by the dark, looming over her like a nightmare come to life. "Time's up," the voice said, and Lena felt the cold chill seep deep into her bones. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen, unable to tear her gaze away from the figure that loomed behind her. Her breath was shallow, each inhale burning in her lungs as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The shadows seemed to stretch and bend around the figure, as though they were alive and crawling toward her. The voice echoed in her mind, soft and sinister. "Time's up." Her instincts screamed at her to run, to escape, but her legs felt like they were made of stone. The air around her grew colder, and the weight of the figure's presence pressed against her like an invisible force. She could almost feel its eyes on her, the dark gaze that seemed to pierce right through her. Every fiber of her being screamed to flee, but she was paralyzed, trapped in this nightmare. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak, but Lena could feel its presence growing stronger with each passing second. It was like an overwhelming tide, pushing her deeper into the void. She had no idea how she knew, but she felt certain that if she turned around, if she faced the figure directly, something terrible would happen. The voice returned, louder now, as if it was right next to her ear, whispering, "You're mine now." Lena's body jerked at the words, and she spun around in a panic, her heart thudding against her ribcage. But the room was empty. No figure, no shadow, just the oppressive darkness. Her hands trembled, and she instinctively reached for the radio, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. She couldn't hear the voice, not anymore, but the presence was still there, still lingering in the air. The radio was silent now, its once comforting hum gone, leaving only the eerie quiet. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her racing mind. It was all too much. The darkness, the voice, the feeling of being watched. How had it all gotten so out of control? She could still hear the faint whispering in the back of her mind, like a memory just out of reach. Every time she tried to focus, to push it away, it slipped back, slipping into her consciousness like a shadow in the corner of her eye. She reached down and turned the dial on the radio, hoping for something familiar, something to ground her. And then static. The radio crackled, and for a moment, Lena thought it was just another malfunction, just another piece of this maddening puzzle that had already consumed her. But then, no, there was something more to it. She could feel it in the air, a chill that ran down her spine as the static grew louder, filling the room like a living thing. She pulled her hand back, but it was too late. A voice broke through the static. "Lena." Her blood ran cold, her entire body stiffening. The voice, it was back, but it was different this time. There was something more to it, something far more sinister. Lena took a step back, her legs trembling beneath her. The radio buzzed and crackled, the voice growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. "I see you. I know what you're thinking." Her heart skipped a beat. The voice knew. It knew everything. Lena backed away slowly, her breath catching in her throat. How could it possibly know? How could it know her thoughts, her secrets? She felt exposed, vulnerable, like something was pulling the very fabric of her reality apart. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the deafening crackle of the radio. There was a pause, a long stretching silence that seemed to last forever. And then the voice responded. "You've been listening for too long, Lena. Now you'll learn the price." The words sent a shiver down her spine, but before she could react, the radio screeched again, the static growing more intense, overwhelming. Her head throbbed with the pressure, the noise becoming unbearable, and the world around her seemed to warp, like the air itself was warping with the force of the radio's energy. Her vision blurred. The walls around her seemed to close in, bending, flickering like a broken television screen. The floor beneath her feet felt unstable, as though she was standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to fall into the abyss. Lena felt herself losing grip on reality. She reached out, trying to steady herself, but everything around her was distorting. The radio's voice was still there, distant but growing louder. "Lena, you can't escape." The voice was like a ghost now, distant and haunting, echoing in her skull. Her head spun as the words seemed to loop over and over again, each one becoming more distorted, more menacing. The room seemed to warp further, and Lena's legs buckled beneath her. She collapsed to the floor, unable to keep her balance. The static grew louder still, the voice now a shrieking wail that filled her ears, drowning everything else out. She pressed her hands against her ears, desperate to block it out. But the sound was inside her head, inside her soul. It was everywhere. Her chest tightened as panic surged within her. The voice, it was suffocating her. She glanced down at the radio, her hands shaking violently as she reached for it, desperate to turn it off. But as her fingers brushed the dial, it stopped. The static fell silent, leaving nothing but the deafening stillness. Lena's heart raced as she waited, holding her breath. Had it stopped? Was it finally over? And then, from the corner of the room, a whisper broke through the silence. "Lena." The voice came from the darkness, soft and sinister. It was no longer coming from the radio. It was coming from the shadows, crawling out of the walls themselves. Lena turned her head slowly, her heart thundering in her chest. And in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the faint light, she saw it. A figure, a face, a pair of eyes glowing in the dark. Eyes that she recognized. Her own. The figure stepped forward, and Lena's blood turned to ice as she saw the reflection of herself standing there. An expression of pure malice twisted on the other Lena's face. The radio came back to life, the static filling the room once again. But now it was mixed with a laugh. A low, menacing laugh that seemed to come from everywhere. "Welcome to the end," the voice whispered, and the figure in the shadows reached out to her. Lena's breath caught in her throat as the dark figure stepped forward, its cold gaze locked on hers. It was her. It wasn't just the shape of her, but the twisted version of herself. Her eyes, her expression, her movements. The way it stepped toward her was mechanical, deliberate, as though it wasn't quite human. It was as if it were something else entirely. Something wrong. The static on the radio grew louder, louder than it had ever been before, echoing in her ears like a maddening hum, filling the space between the two of them. The figure's lips twisted into a grin, one that was not her own, but disturbingly familiar. "I've been waiting for you," the voice said, not through the radio this time, but from the reflection itself, as though the figure in the shadows had taken on a life of its own. "It's almost time." Lena's legs trembled beneath her, her body frozen in place. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her mind raced. What was this? Was it a hallucination? A nightmare? Or was this real? "Who are you?" Lena gasped, her voice trembling with fear. She couldn't believe the words were even leaving her lips. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. It was like her body had betrayed her, trapped in this nightmare that seemed to have no end. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out its hand, her hand, and placed it gently on her cheek. The touch was cold, too cold, ice cold, like it had been dipped in the darkest depths of the earth. Lena's skin crawled at the contact, but she couldn't pull away. Her body felt like it was being pulled toward the figure, drawn in by something she couldn't explain. Her breath caught in her throat again as the reflection smiled at her. that twisted version of herself staring back with eyes that were hollow, blackened pits. "You've been listening, haven't you?" the figure whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. The radio buzzed behind her, faintly alive with static, but she couldn't tear her attention away from the figure. "You heard the voice. You know what it's capable of." Lena shook her head, her mind spinning. The radio, the voice. She had thought it was just a prank, some weird broadcast glitch, but now it was clear. It was something far worse. Who is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it took a step closer to her, its face inches from hers. Lena could feel its cold breath against her skin, sending shivers down her spine. The darkness around them seemed to pulse with energy, suffocating her. It was all around her now. The room, the shadows, the very air she breathed. It was as if the room itself had become a part of the nightmare. The static on the radio intensified, swirling in her head like a cyclone. It was almost unbearable, the noise and the fear melding together into a suffocating wave. "You've already met it," the reflection whispered. "And now it's coming for you. It's already inside you." Lena stumbled backward, her hands pressed to her ears as if she could block out the sound, block out the suffocating presence that filled the room. She could feel her pulse racing, her mind unraveling. What did it mean? Inside her? Was the voice connected to her somehow? The reflection took another step forward, its hands now grasping her shoulders with a force that made Lena wince. It looked into her eyes with an intensity that seemed to pierce her very soul. "You've been chosen," it said softly, almost tenderly. "The voice is inside you now. Can't be stopped. You're connected. Forever." Lena's heart skipped a beat. The voice, the dark whisper on the radio, the static, the overwhelming presence. It had all been leading to this. The connection. It was real. "No." Lena shook her head violently. "No, this can't be happening. This isn't real. You're not real." The figure tilted its head, and the smile deepened. "I'm as real as you are, Lena, and so is the voice. The voice that knows you, that sees everything. It's been with you all along. All those secrets, all those thoughts, we've been watching. You've been listening." "No!" Lena cried out, her body shaking. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" The reflection stepped back, finally releasing her. But it didn't go away. It stayed there, looming in the shadows, its hollow eyes still staring at her. "It's not what I want," it said, its voice soft now. "It's what it wants. It wants to be heard. It wants you." Before Lena could respond, the radio behind her crackled to life again, the static growing louder, more erratic. The voice, that haunting, familiar voice, filled the room. "I told you, Lena," it whispered. "You're mine now." The figure in the shadows smiled again, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. Lena's blood ran cold as she realized the full extent of what she had just heard. The voice wasn't just some strange phenomenon. It wasn't just a random broadcast. It was a presence, a thing, and it was inside her. She turned away from the reflection, her eyes darting to the radio. The sound was deafening now, pounding in her skull. The air around her vibrated with it, like the room was alive with the force of its power. With shaking hands, she reached for the dial, desperate to turn it off, to silence it, to end this nightmare. But as soon as her fingers touched the radio, the voice screamed through the static, sharp and penetrating. "You can't stop it, Lena. You can't stop me." Lena jerked her hand back, gasping in horror. The voice, its voice, was coming from inside her, from the very core of her being. The static had become a part of her, invading her thoughts, twisting her mind. Her body trembled, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. It was happening. She couldn't escape. She was trapped in this nightmare, trapped with the voice that had taken root in her soul. "Help me," she whispered, her voice breaking, but the room remained silent. The figure in the shadows was gone, and the radio static had faded to a dull hum. But the presence remained, a dark, suffocating weight that pressed down on her chest. Lena collapsed to her knees, her head spinning. Her mind raced, but there were no answers. No way out. Only the voice, the static, and the creeping darkness that seemed to crawl through every corner of her life. She had been chosen, and there was no turning back. Lena sat in the dark room, her hands trembling as she clutched the radio in front of her. The static had subsided, but the chill in the air was unbearable, thick with the weight of something unseen, something malevolent. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of the voice that had claimed her. The room was eerily silent, but she could feel it, its presence. It was there, always there, just beneath the surface. Her mind raced with confusion and fear. What was happening to her? Was this a curse? A mental breakdown? Or was there something more sinister at work? She couldn't make sense of it, no matter how hard she tried. The voice, the reflection in the dark, the whispering, the static. They were all part of it, part of him. But who was he? And why was he doing this? She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the mounting terror that threatened to swallow her whole. She could hear it again. No, not hear it, feel it. A low hum vibrating through the air like an electric current, seeping into her very bones. The radio crackled softly beside her, its dial still unmoved from where she had left it. Lena hesitated for a moment, her breath shallow, her mind warning her not to touch it. But she had to know. She had to understand what was happening to her. She needed answers, even if they terrified her. Slowly, she reached for the dial, her fingers brushing the cool metal. A chill ran down her spine as she turned it, half expecting the voice to return in full force. But instead, there was only more static, more of that maddening hum. And then, just when she thought it would stay silent, the voice returned, low, almost soothing, like a whisper in the dark. "I know you're afraid, Lena," the voice said, its words wrapping around her mind, pulling her in. "You can't run from me. You can't hide. You're already mine." Lena gasped, her grip tightening on the radio. The voice, it knew her. It knew her deepest fears, her darkest secrets, the things she could never escape. "How? Why? Stop it! Stop!" Lena shouted, her voice breaking as she struggled to tear herself away from the voice's hold. But it was impossible. She was trapped. Every word, every syllable, felt like it was digging into her soul, leaving an indelible mark that she couldn't erase. "You think you can shut me out?" The voice continued, its tone now mocking, cruel. "You think turning me off will make it go away? No, Lena, you can't escape me. I'm a part of you now." She felt a cold wave of dread wash over her, and her mind raced. The voice had told her she was connected to it. But what did that mean? Was it controlling her? Was it feeding on her fear? Or was it something else entirely? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp sound. A knock. A knock at the door. Lena froze. Her heart skipped a beat. Who could be knocking? No one knew she was here. Not after the night she'd just had. No one. The voice in the radio seemed to sense her fear, its laugh cutting through the silence. "You think they're here to help you? They won't save you, Lena," it hissed, the static rising again, almost to a deafening level. "They're not real. They're just like me, figments of your imagination." Another knock, louder this time. Lena felt her pulse quicken. She stood slowly, her legs shaking beneath her. She wanted to run, She wanted to lock herself away, but the presence of the voice, the force of it, had her paralyzed. She couldn't move. The knock came again, louder still, more urgent. She had to check. She had to know if it was real. Lena took a shaky step toward the door, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Her hands trembled as she reached for the doorknob, and with one final deep breath, she twisted it open. And there, standing in the doorway, was someone she didn't recognize. A man tall, wearing a long black coat. His face was obscured by a dark hood, his features hidden in the shadow cast by the dim light. He stood motionless, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Lena's heart skipped another beat. She was too afraid to move. Who was this man? Was he part of whatever was happening to her? Was he connected to the voice? Who are you? Lena managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't speak at first. He just stood there, staring at her with eyes that she couldn't see, as if he were waiting for something. The silence was oppressive, as if time itself had stopped. Finally, his voice broke the silence, and when he spoke, it was like the sound of 1,000 whispers in the dark. "You're not safe here, Lena. You never have been." Lena's breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening with fear. She knew somehow that he was speaking the truth. She hadn't been safe since the moment the radio had first spoken to her. The voice, it had been following her, watching her, waiting for the right moment. I don't understand," Lena stammered, her eyes darting between the man and the radio, now crackling ominously on the table behind her. "What do you want from me?" The man took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate, almost calculated. "It's not what I want, Lena," he said softly. "It's what it wants. The voice you've been hearing, the one that knows you better than you know yourself, it's not just a voice. It's a gateway." "A gateway?" Lena repeated, her voice trembling. "What do you mean? What do you mean, gateway?" The man's gaze grew more intense, his voice lower, more serious. "The voice on the radio is just the beginning. It's been using you, and now it's about to step through." Lena recoiled, her mind reeling. What was he talking about? Step through? How could something like that even happen? It was madness. But the way he spoke, so sure, so calm, it terrified her. And then, before she could say another word, the radio behind her crackled louder than ever before, its static turning into a low growl. The voice returned, now louder than before, more menacing. "You can't stop it, Lena," the voice hissed. "I'm coming for you." The room seemed to pulse with energy, the air thick with an invisible force that pressed down on Lena's chest. She gasped for breath, her knees buckling beneath her. The man reached out, his hand grabbing hers with surprising strength. "It's already too late," he whispered. And then, with a final, bone-chilling laugh, the voice on the radio exploded in a deafening roar. Lena could barely breathe. The man's grip on her arm was tight, unrelenting, as if he was trying to anchor her to something more solid than the trembling ground beneath her. The voice on the radio was deafening now, an overwhelming roar that filled every corner of the room, vibrating through her bones, rattling her thoughts. "You're too late," the voice screamed. "It's already started. There's no turning back now." Lena's heart raced, her mind spinning in a whirlwind of terror. She could feel the oppressive weight of the voice pressing down on her, like a living thing, pushing her into the ground. Her legs felt weak, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse under the sheer force of it all. But the man, this stranger, held her steady, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that was both frightening and reassuring. "Listen to me," he said, his voice urgent, cutting through the chaos. "You need to get out of here. Now." Lena's gaze darted to the radio, the static still crackling with an unnatural intensity. The voice had grown stronger, more insistent, and yet there was something else, something in the background, like a low growl, a distant hum of something otherworldly. "Why?" Lena gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "What is this? What's happening?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, as if checking the room for something unseen. His eyes flickered nervously, and Lena saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. Whatever was happening, it was beyond his control too. "The radio," he said, his voice strained. "It's a portal, a doorway between worlds, and it's about to open." Lena's blood ran cold. Portal? To where? What kind of world was he talking about? "I don't understand," she stammered. "How do I stop it?" The man's grip on her arm tightened even further, his face serious now, almost pleading. "You can't stop it. It's already begun. All you can do is run, Lena. You need to get as far away from this place as you can." "No!" she shouted, shaking her head. "I'm not leaving. Not until I know what's happening." "What is that thing? The voice? What does it want with me?" The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes dark with unspoken fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say another word, the voice on the radio interrupted him, louder than ever before. "You can't escape me, Lena," the voice hissed, its tone dripping with malice. "You've already made your choice. You belong to me now." The static screeched, and for a brief moment, Lena thought she might lose her mind to the overwhelming noise. It felt like the room itself was vibrating with the power of the voice, each word a pulse, a shockwave that pushed against her chest. The man's face twisted with frustration. He turned toward the radio, his eyes flashing with determination. "Stop!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. "You don't know what you're doing." But the voice just laughed. It wasn't the mocking laugh of before. No, this time it was different. It was deeper, darker, filled with an inhuman force. "Too late," the voice rasped. "I am already inside her. She is mine." Lena could feel it now. The pull, the connection. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, an entity, one that had been weaving its way into her mind from the very beginning. The voice wasn't just speaking to her, it was trying to control her, to consume her. She took a step back, trying to break free of the man's hold, but his grip tightened once more, as if he knew that she would run, that she would try to flee from this nightmare. He couldn't let her. Not yet. "You don't understand," he said, his voice trembling with urgency. "The voice, it's a summoning. It's not just a broadcast. It's calling something. Something ancient." Lena's mind spun, her breath quickening. What was he saying? A summoning? What could possibly be summoned by something as simple as a radio? Before she could ask another question, the room suddenly grew darker. The light in the corners seemed to drain away, leaving only the dim glow of the radio. The air turned thick, heavy, suffocating. The hum, the growl, intensified, and Lena could feel the walls closing in on her, as though the very house was alive, breathing, shifting. The man's face paled, his eyes wide with fear. "It's coming," he whispered, almost to himself. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she turned toward the door. But it wasn't just the radio anymore. It was the air, the room, the entire space around her. She could feel it, something watching from the darkness. Something that had been hidden, lurking in the corners of her mind, and now it was here. A low hiss echoed through the room, the voice on the radio growing louder still, its words now a frenzy of angry whispers. "Your mind," the voice growled, the sound vibrating through Lena's body, sending chills down her spine. "I've been waiting for this moment." Lena backed away, her breath ragged, her vision blurring as the room seemed to twist and bend around her. The radio flickered, its static intensifying, as though the very fabric of reality was being ripped apart at the seams. The man was no longer looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the radio, his expression one of pure horror. He raised his hand, a faint shimmer of something, a glow, appeared in his palm, like a thin, glowing thread that connected him to the radio. "Don't!" Lena screamed, but it was too late. The man muttered something under his breath. A chant? A prayer perhaps, but it was drowned out by the voice that screeched in response. The radio crackled and burst with a violent explosion of static. The force of it sent Lena stumbling backward, crashing into the wall behind her. And then silence. For one fleeting moment, there was nothing. No voice, no hum, no growl, just the oppressive stillness, thick and suffocating. Lena blinked, trying to clear the ringing in her ears, but her pulse hammered in her throat. What just happened?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond. His eyes were wide, filled with disbelief. He slowly turned toward Lena, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. His expression was one of pure fear. And then, the radio turned itself back on. The voice, cold and final, reverberated through the room, its words sending a shockwave of fear straight through Lena's veins. "It's too late," the voice said, its tone more sinister than ever before. "You're mine now, forever." Lena's body went rigid, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment it all came crashing down. She had been pulled into this, deeper than she could have ever imagined. And now the world she knew was slipping away, replaced by something far darker, far more dangerous. And as the last words echoed in her mind, Lena knew one thing for certain. She was no longer just hearing the voice on the radio. She had become a part of it,